It's week 19 in the Bible Challenge, and we are continuing in 1 Kings, starting 2 Kings. We'll be starting at Psalm 105 this week and finishing up most of the Acts of the Apostles. In 1 Kings, we're finishing up, and the final story here in chapter 22 really needs to be read together with that found in chapter 20 as a pair which encompasses the story of Naboth's vineyard, which we saw in chapter 21. The death of Ahab is related here, and the death of Ahab and the defeat of Israel are announced and realized during the course of a disastrous campaign against Syria. The prophetic narrative comes before the story, unlike the order found in chapters 20 and 21. The remainder of 1 Kings involves telling of Ahab's death, and a very brief mention of subsequent failure and failed reigns. Now, the division of the narrative between 1 Kings and 2 Kings is just completely arbitrary and does not correspond to a second event. But at this point, we do start 2 Kings, and the narrative continues between the two books in the midst of the telling of stories about Ahaziah's reign. The story of the kings changes in chapter 2 of 2 Kings with the appearance of Elisha. The Elisha cycle of stories will continue well into chapter 8, and Elisha and his extraordinary power are a focus of attention, the focus of attention. The cycle begins with the testing of Elisha, who was called back in 1 Kings 19 to determine his loyalty to his master Elijah. The cycle is interrupted with the story of Jehoram as king and his mild cultic reform, which involves destroying a pillar of Baal, is not true reform and thus not enough to save him. He's going to go down in chapter 9 of 2 Kings. The cycle continues with a complex of 10 different legends, chapters 4 through 8 here. And the stories are legendary in the sense that they do not name characters other than Elisha. And their purpose includes the evocation of wonderment at the hero's powers. The stories alternate between those in which the prophet deals with his own people and those in which he interacts with Gentiles. We get the widow's plight being relieved through the miraculous multiplication of oil in chapter 4. The prophet raising the son of the Shunammite woman, also in chapter 4. Elisha counteracting food poisoning in chapter 4. The prophet multiplying bread in chapter 4. Being master over leprosy in chapter 5. An axe head, iron being made to float in the water, chapter 6. The prophet is a military resource in chapter 6. He can discern the plans of the Syrian king and the Syrian army at a distance. Samaria is delivered from the siege of Ben-Hadad by reason of the prophet's clairvoyant and predictive powers, chapters 6 and 7. Property is recovered in 8, and we're to read that together with the story back in the raising of the son of the Shunammite woman. And finally, the divine directive given to Elijah at 1 Kings 19:15 is realized in the accession of Hazael as king of Syria. Now, in chapter 9, the Elisha cycle has ended, and there begins a history of the Israelite and Judean monarchs in the last 125 years of the two kingdoms' coexistence. The narrative is very similar to that found in 1 Kings, chapters 14 through 16, from which it is separated by the Elijah and the Elisha cycles, and in which the focus is on prophetic as opposed to royal figures in that interruption. The history continues then. Jehu is anointed by Elisha, and his bloody doings are depicted as the fulfillment of prophecy, and so they're divinely sanctioned. We can note especially at the end of chapter 9 the account of Jezebel's violent death as a fulfillment of Elijah's prophecy. And Jehu, in effect, mops up survivors and supporters of the Israelite royal houses. These political measures reach a climax in the religious reforms of Jehu, in which the prophets of Baal are destroyed. Despite these reforms, however, Jehu does not destroy the calf cult instituted by Jeroboam I, and so Jehu is himself destroyed. And through the end of the rest of the readings this week, we're just going to get stories of successive kings. The Psalms, we start at Psalm 105 this week, the history of Israel from Abraham to the Exodus and the conquest of the Promised Land. This is being recited in a hymnic form. This is the only psalm, which mentions the patriarchs and Joseph in historical narrative. In Psalm 106, we also have an historical recital, like Psalms 78 and 105. However, where Psalm 105 is a hymn, Psalm 106 is a communal lament. The recital of Israel's rebellion against God is framed by celebrations of the salvation effected by the Lord. Psalm 107 is also a communal hymn of thanksgiving here, punctuated by two refrains. The first being, "They cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress," and the second being, "Let them give thanks to the Lord for his mercy and the wonders he does for his children." In Psalm 108, we switch back to the lament form that includes both individual and communal elements. Psalm is probably from after the exile and is made up from verses in Psalm 57 and Psalm 60 are included here. The combination of these earlier laments speaks to the situation of the community following exile. In Psalm 109, we have an individual lament of one who has been falsely accused. The verses 5 through 19 are treated as optional in the lectionary. This is because they're not nice. They're quite bloody and vindictive. However, they serve as a good example of how every human emotion can be found in the Psalter. When we're honest, we recognize that there are times that we at least wish that very bad things would happen to other people. So taking them out of the regular lectionary and making them optional means we're trying to pretty things up a little bit in ways that don't recognize our own fallenness. A minority of scholars would argue that these difficult words in verses 5 through 19 are not in fact those of the psalmist, but are quotations of the words of his accusers. The reference in verse 5 is made to an accuser, but in Hebrew the definite article here, "the," is used, and the word accuser in the sense of prosecuting attorney is Satan. The term is also used then, Satan, as a name at Zechariah chapter 3, verse 1. But in the final verse of the psalm, it is not the Satan or Satan himself who stands at the psalmist's right hand, but it is God who does so. Even therefore, if this is a reference to the devil, the psalm concludes with a recitation of how God saves. The psalm is appointed for Good Friday in the so-called Ambroseian rite. That means it takes its origin in the See of St. Ambrose of Milan, Italy. In the Western Church, there were, before the Renaissance, a number of different uses, as they were called. These are different liturgies in different parts of the church. The Book of Common Prayer in the Episcopal Church, for example, comes very much from the so-called Sarum rite, S-A-R-U-M, which was the Mass as said in Salisbury Cathedral in England. You also had the Ambrosian rite out of Milan, the Leonine rite out of Rome, and the Mozarabic rite out of Spain. This psalm was used on Good Friday in, let's call it the Milan rite, with the rationale for this use finding its origin in an argument by St. Thomas Aquinas that Christ lay under a curse, that he might deliver us from the curse of the law. In Psalm 110, we get two divine oracles to the Davidic king, voiced as the words of a prophet. The psalm may date from the time of Solomon. Verse 1 is the Old Testament text most frequently quoted in the New Testament. The meaning and translation of verse 3 are obscure, as testified to wide variations in translation. And at a human level, the verse 4 reference to Melchizedek, who we encountered back at the end of chapter 14 in Genesis, seems to point to the Davidic monarch succeeding to the status, including priesthood, of the former Jebusite kings of Zion. At the level of divine oracle and Christian typology, the eternal priesthood of Jesus Christ is understood to be referred to here in the reference to Melchizedek, and that is the way this verse is understood in the letter to the Hebrews in the New Testament at Hebrews 5:6 and 7:3. In the Acts of the Apostles now, we are starting this week at chapter 20, and we have the stories of Paul's final travels between Greece and Asia in chapter 20, and of Paul as a prisoner and defendant in Palestine. This latter narrative, which begins in chapter 21, extends beyond the readings this week to end in chapter 26. In chapter 20, Paul's farewell to his missions is described. And if we compare this to other speeches in Acts, the discourse is of a different type, a farewell to Christians, not an evangelical teaching to those who do not know God. Paul announces both the end of his missions and the beginning of his trials and imprisonment. The speech, therefore, serves as a transition between two long narratives, one of mission and one of passion. And it's a Lucan parallel to the life of Jesus. Luke is always making the parallel in Acts that the disciples, those who follow Christ, will reenact what Christ did. So first they will be in mission, then they will suffer as Jesus did. Paul returns to Jerusalem. On his way, he stops in Caesarea Maritima, which is the Roman seat of power in Palestine, and Agabus prophesies Paul's imprisonment. Agabus, in effect, acts out his prophecy like an Old Testament prophet would. Paul arrives in Jerusalem, which is at a fever pitch of Jewish nationalism under Roman occupation. And the populace is therefore more overtly hostile to the Christian community. It is in this context that James relates the accusation against Paul, and that Paul makes a display of his fidelity by going to the temple. Paul is arrested in the temple on the basis of the accusations of Jews from Asia who have knowledge of his missionary work. And a riot ensues in which the Roman military intervenes to restore order. Paul's taken prisoner by the Romans. This recapitulates Jesus' passion. Accusations by the people, then the Romans intervening militarily. Accused by the people, tried under Roman law. Paul offers 3 speeches of defense found in the trial section of Acts. The speech does not address the charge that caused the riot, but is a proclamation of the faith, this first speech. The proclamation is rejected by the crowd in confirmation of Jesus' words, and the Romans propose to scourge Paul, who invokes his Roman citizenship and thus his right to trial. In verse 28 of chapter 22, it's made clear that Paul outranks the tribune, who probably has purchased his citizenship. Paul is brought before the Jewish Sanhedrin, which has been summoned by the Roman tribune, which is at best unique in history. Whether the meeting is a meeting or a trial is not entirely clear, but the narrative is one of historical continuity with the arraignment of Jesus, which we found back in chapter 22 of Luke, and the accusations against Peter and John found back in chapter 4 of Acts, against the apostles, chapter 5, against Stephen, chapter 6. The judicial process against the earthly Jesus has been continued through 4 trials in Acts, where the accused is the risen Lord of the Kerygma. In other words, the disciples are standing in Jesus' stead for proclaiming that he is Lord. They are standing before a human court, just as Jesus stands before the judgment seat to intercede for all of those saved by him against accusation. There's a plot to kill Paul, and the Roman commander transfers Paul to the garrison at Caesarea Maritima, the seat of the governor. Now, the number of troops assigned to this transfer would have been about half of the garrison in Jerusalem. If you do the math on this one and compare it to modern usage, because both infantry and cavalry are assigned here, and we're talking about a cohort and an ala of cavalry, if we were to put this in 21st century parlance, we would say this would be a reinforced regiment of armored cavalry. Clearly, the Romans are expecting big trouble here. This would be like rolling more than a battalion of the United States Army with armored vehicles. The letter that the tribune sends to the governor neatly summarizes the issue being presented from a Roman point of view. Paul is guilty of no crime under Roman law, but his presence in Jerusalem is leading to unrest. And the letter, in effect, parallels the attitude that Pontius Pilate had to Jesus. Paul offers another apology speech before the governor, Felix. This follows a speech of accusation made by a spokesman the high priest has sent. And central to Paul's defense is his confession at chapter 24, verses 14 to 15, which defines Christian life in terms of the Old Testament Jewish life. The governor is corrupt, no big surprise, and he leaves Paul in prison for 2 years. When he's replaced, the new governor leaves Paul in prison as well, and Paul appeals under Roman law to the emperor. The new governor, Festus, then, seeking to curry favor with the Jews, meets with them in Jerusalem and summons Paul to appear before King Agrippa II. This is one of these little semi-monarchs, sort of an heir to Herod. The governor's playing politics. He's brought a puppet in. Agrippa is clearly a puppet. The king's arrival is filled with pomp, setting the scene for Paul's final apology speech in Acts. And that's where we'll end for this week. Next week we will take up the last 3 chapters of Acts and begin the letter to the Romans. In the Old Testament, we'll be finishing out the 2nd book of the Kings, beginning 1st Chronicles, and we'll be continuing through the Psalms. May God bless you in your study of His holy word this week.